Welcome to Supply Circles, stories from the innovators, disruptors and improvers in supply chain management today. Brought to you by AI Group.
Hello, I'm James Scotland, coming to you today from Yunganbar country, and this is the podcast that asks the question, how can we in Australia create supply chains that are resilient and sustainable at a time when we're implementing the challenges of the 3Ds? You know, the digitalisation to keep up with your peers and your industries and to build efficiencies into your business. Decarbonisation to meet your legal requirements and targets by 2050 and in some states even earlier. And diversification to build sustainability into your business offerings and processes by reducing the dependence on single relationships, whether that's a product, a technology, a supply chain, or an export market. Today, let's revisit decarbonisation of your business on a global scale. Every year around this time, I talk to Tennant Reed, AI Group's Director of Climate Change and Energy, and we talk about his annual upcoming trip to COP. What's COP, you say? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you. In 1992, countries joined an international treaty called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was a framework for international cooperation to combat climate change with the aim to limit average global temperature increases and the resulting climate change, which was identified as having inevitable impacts. In 1995, countries launched negotiations to strengthen the global response, and 2 years later, they adopted the now famous Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol legally binds developed countries or parties to emission reduction targets. The protocol's first commitment period started in 2008 and ended in 2012. The second commitment period went from 2013 and ended in 2020. And there are now 197 parties to the convention. That's 197 countries out of around 205, depending on how you define a country, and 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol. It's a global enterprise, it's a global activity. 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol, 197 parties to the convention. Every year there is a conference of the 197 parties held in a different city around the world. The 29th Conference of Parties, or COP29 for short, will be held in a few weeks in Baku, Azerbaijan, and Tennant will be there. So it's a good time to talk to Tennant. In fact, I say it'll be held in a couple of weeks, but in actual fact, by the time this drops, it'll be, I think you'll be there on the 8th of, this will drop on the 1st of November, and I think you'll be there on the 5th. Anyway, welcome to the show, Tennant. Have you learned how to say hello in Azerbaijan yet?
I have not, but g'day, and it's great to be with you. I can say, at least to you here in Australia.
That's right. G'day or something. Let's talk about, before we get to the Conference of Parties, well, I should introduce you. Tennant is, as I said, the Director of Climate Change and Energy for Australian Industry Group. He's in the top 50, I think, influencers in the industry in Australia. And he's also the co-host of a very popular podcast called Let Me Sum Up, which gives climate change geeks an opportunity to just geek out on a regular basis. Is that a good plug for your podcast?
Oh, that's very generous, James. That pod is about summarising reports that people haven't had the time to read. And there's a lot of reports on climate and energy, as there are on so many topics. So happy to be chatting on your pod today.
Thank you. And you do that with Alurk and somebody else. And
Frankie Muscovic.
Yeah, Frankie. And all of you will be in Baku?
We will. Not for the whole of it, all three of us together, but there'll be a strong Australian contingent at these things, always. And it is going to be good to catch up with some people, weirdly, that I don't see from Australia except at these international conventions.
Yeah, it's weird the way that works, isn't it? It's a small world in many ways. Let's talk about climate change and the decarbonisation of our economy and our industry. Where's it up to, Tennant? You know, there's the net zero targets by 2050, where we have to not be putting any carbon into the air. But you know, from your perspective, where's it up to now? Is it behind, ahead of schedule? Climate change is being accepted? I don't know. Whatever you think, give us a business view of this project or this process.
Sure. Well, so I think there's two different things that people need to try and keep in their head at once. One is that there is genuinely a massive set of energy and climate transitions going on. The transformation of energy and industrial futures that has already taken place through the growth, particularly of renewable energy, but also the change in the pattern of growth of places like China and, for that matter, the United States, that has avoided a huge amount of the emissions growth and the future temperature increase that was feared as recently as a decade ago. We have avoided some of the worst potential climate futures that were in front of us. But that transition...
There's always a but.
Yeah, indeed. It has not so far happened fast enough for us to avoid as much climate change as we are intending to achieve. So the International Energy Agency recently updated their World Energy Outlook. That is the exercise through which they say what would current energy policies actually implemented around the world deliver, what would pledges that haven't yet been translated into concrete policy deliver, and what would be needed to deliver on the overall goals of limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees. So the Paris Agreement that succeeded the Kyoto Protocol included the twin temperature goals of keeping global temperature increase beyond pre-industrial levels to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And those don't sound like huge differences. Actually, they have very large differences in the impacts on the economy, on nature, on people in terms of extreme temperature increases, the amount of coastal inundation, the amount of the Great Barrier Reef and other reefs that we could expect to retain in light of the impact of high ocean temperatures on bleaching. All these things that are pretty bad today could be a lot worse if global temperatures go beyond 1.5, and even worse if they go beyond 2. The IEA's latest estimate is that current policies would see global temperatures rise by 2.6 degrees by the end of this century, so well above the 2-degree goal. The commitments that countries have made would keep that to 1.7, 1.8 degrees if they are translated into more concrete policy. And, of course, that still leaves a large gap to the 1.5 degree goal. And 1.5 degrees, there is only a very narrow path left that can keep the world within that. And it involves a lot of negative emissions, in addition to reducing and avoiding all the emissions we can, actually capturing a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere and locking that up in forests or in soils or underground. That's a huge enterprise, and I think some people are coming to the conclusion that 1.5 degrees simply won't be achieved. Even if that's correct, 1.6 is better than 1.7, is better than 2, is better than 2.6 in terms of the opportunity to prevent a whole lot of economic and human and environmental damage. So is that glass half full, glass half empty? We've avoided some really bad stuff, but there's some pretty bad stuff still there to be avoided.
Yeah, it's a bit like saying you've got a temperature of 37 rather than 32, whatever normal human body is. And it was as good as come down from 38, because at 38 you're going to die. But we've come down a little bit. So great, but I'm still awfully sick. I mean, we're still we're still in the trouble range, aren't we?
Yeah. Look, breaking your leg is better than falling off a cliff, but I'd rather do neither if I could possibly avoid it.
Yeah, and we're going to get stuck in sort of weird metaphors, so we might move on. One of the things that you and I have talked about a lot, whilst we stay on this topic, is that whilst it still seems to be up for debate when talking to Joe Public in Australia, this getting to 1.5, getting down to 1.5 is not a thought bubble or something that we might do, something we might try and think about. There's massive industries around trying to make this happen, isn't there? Smart people are working on it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there's a huge amount of effort towards climate transition, net zero, 1.5 degrees, however you choose to characterize the objectives. The amount of investment, commercial investment, as well as public support going around the world into this set of transitions is very, very large. And in fact, there was significantly more invested in various forms of clean energy, in wind, in solar, in batteries, and in nuclear for that matter, last year than there was in the sum total of the oil sector, the gas sector, and the coal sector worldwide. So this, like commercially, industrially, this is for real as a big set of transformations that are really changing a lot of markets and creating opportunities for many businesses, but also of course, creating vulnerabilities and risks for those who are currently servicing demand for fossil fuels, where that demand is starting to peak, and it will decline. It's pretty clear, and again, in the IEA's projections, in all scenarios, even just current, if there's no new energy policies anywhere around the world ever, they would expect that coal demand will drop quite substantially over the next 10, 15 years, and a bunch of gas demand will fail to eventuate. You'll have a levelling off of that demand. That is a worrying market for people who are supplying goods and services into that sector. And one where diversification is a good idea.
Yeah, I've said on this podcast many times that when we went from horse and cart to cars, which is just one part of this energy transition, just changing the way we fuel cars, but it used to be a really good business to be in the horseshoe business. It was a very big industry. But forward lookers would say, hang on, that's not going to be around in the future. I need to start thinking about new business opportunities, new business models. And that's where many businesses would be today, to start thinking about what's the new opportunities in this new world. What's been keeping you amused and intrigued lately? You mentioned policy. Is there a whole bunch of new policies coming out with the Australian government, or is it sort of tightening up what we've been doing? What have you been doing?
So there is a lot going on. And
I thought you'd say that.
Among the things, the federal government is currently developing decarbonisation plans for 6 major sectors of the Australian economy.
Oh,
Industry is a sector, apparently. That one's got to deal with steel, with cement, with chemicals, and I would hope with helping the transition of process heat in a much broader array of industrial contexts. But they're looking at transport, they're looking at agriculture, resources, the built environment, and electricity and energy more broadly. And those plans will inform a decision, maybe early next year, we'll have to see, on what Australia's next big climate target will be. So we have a national commitment that's in legislation, and it's been lodged internationally as part of the Paris Agreement. We've got a commitment to reduce national emissions by 43% below that 2005 level by 2030. And we're making progress towards that goal, but it's a bit hairy whether we will hit it exactly in 2030. We are obliged under the Paris Agreement to come up with a succession of further goals, and other countries can't tell us what those goals should be. That's up for us to determine. But what we have committed through the Paris Agreement is that each successive goal will be more ambitious than the last. So government's having a think, what's the big number for 2035? And from that and from these sector plans will flow a lot of the next wave of policy change that businesses in all of those sectors will be affected by, some helped, some maybe facing new costs. We'll have to see. There's many things that would need to happen to approach net zero economy-wide, and we have spent in our national debate and policy discussions, we've spent most of our collective time in the past 20 years focused on the electricity sector. Electricity is very important, but we're on our way to very deep decarbonisation of that sector. Now it is, well, how are we decarbonising freight? How are we decarbonising the production of the basic materials that our economy relies on? What are we able to do in agriculture? So, those are big questions. And the fact that there's an election coming up early next year, most likely, maybe first half of May, that's the last date it could be, that is a complicating factor for trying to get these long-term plans settled and in a form that will actually be useful to industry to work with, invest towards, and plan on themselves on the basis of.
It sounds like these industry sectors, we're starting to put some meat on the bones as to how we're going to move from where we are to where we get to. Is that too
that's
big?
Right.
That's not too big?
No, I think that's very fair. And of course, then the Australian government is not going to set a plan in stone in early 2025 and then just execute that 2025 plan for steel or whatever subsector you focus on for the next 25 years. They will be iterated, of course. So these plans will have to be iterated, but you do need a starting point and a look across all these sectors so that they are mutually coherent. For instance, industry could do a lot. Industry uses a lot of natural gas today. We could make use of biomethane in future for the same purposes. But if we're looking for biomethane and the transport sector is looking for biofuels, including sustainable aviation fuel, if we're trying to up the amount of negative emissions, that ripping carbon out of the atmosphere and sticking it underground by doing bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, can we produce enough biomass sustainably and affordably to do all of those things? Or are we going to have to prioritise? That's the kind of question that it's really helpful to do this broad exercise with multiple sectors and then, try and make the pieces fit together in a coherent way.
Yeah, we've had the great Jim Wilson from Shipping Australia on the podcast, and his job, of course, is to talk up shipping, and he was telling us about how container ships and the other global shipping activities are well ahead in trying to decarbonise their footprint. And we've also had food companies on who have talked about they need to go back to agriculture because that's a really big carbon emitter. It's an industry-wide challenge. and it's nice to have it pulled together like you just did then. We should talk about COP, Conference of Parties.
Yep.
Last year was 28.
It was 28 in Dubai.
And I thought it was in Egypt.
It was COP27.
Oh, I missed a year.
How could you miss Dubai? It was the biggest COP ever.
Yeah, and there was challenges, wasn't there? Because there's a whole bunch of old people walking around and doing things, and it caused some kerfuffle, I think. Is that right?
There was kerfuffle, yes. So a factoid spread through the media that there were thousands of oil industry big polluters walking the halls and pathways of COP in Dubai and drowning out the voices of civil society. And I was there for the whole duration. There certainly were a lot of business people there. Because I'm a nerd, I went through the registration spreadsheet for the COP, and the numbers that some campaigners were complaining about were quite considerably exaggerated. They were counting essentially every business person at the COP as a big polluter. And the oil and gas people were a much smaller number. We'll see what it's like this year because Dubai had about 100,000 people registered to attend the secure part of the conference. And they weren't all there on the same day, and some of them didn't turn up at all. But that was, by a considerable margin, the biggest COP ever. It was a bit ridiculous how big it was, and this year is going to be intentionally much smaller. And so we'll see what the balance is like among different sorts of participant there. But most of the oil and gas people who were there last year were actually from state-owned oil companies from countries like Qatar or Vietnam or Malaysia or many others. And the thing about these conferences is they are conferences in the first instance between countries. All the rest of us, civil society, business, we can go along and observe, but the negotiators are working on behalf of nations. And those nations are not going to forget that they own an oil industry, or they're not going to forget who is important in their domestic economy and their domestic constituency based on who they do and don't happen to bump into on a pathway at COP. So how these things really work is very different to how people sometimes imagine they do.
You've been to many. Do they work?
They are very frustrating processes, but they're also very essential. So they do make progress, sometimes agonizingly slowly. There are other ways to try and pursue better global response to climate change, including through smaller groupings of countries. But there are some issues that you can't deal with without dealing with everybody in the conversation, all nations in that conversation. And one of the reasons for that is that some of the biggest economies will not participate in a forum that excludes a lot of other countries. China is very wary of being isolated and much more comfortable in a forum where there's, 150 plus other variously friendly or at least in a developing country situation parties. And that's a frustrating feature of these things, but it's hard to get away from. They have delivered the Paris Agreement, which is the first everybody's in and committing to do something international agreement on climate change. Paris is not the be-all, end-all or the last word, but it's the best global cooperation agreement we have on climate. And again, you can say the same thing of the COPs that you can say of the whole international response to climate change, which is a lot has been achieved, but it's not yet enough to avoid all the climate change that we ought to be able to avoid.
If I remember what you said earlier, and from our previous conversations, the Paris Agreement was every country would set targets that were better than what they are delivering right now. It wasn't the whole world's going to drop by 5% or something or other. There was individual countries had their own sovereignty.
Yeah. So the feature of the Kyoto Protocol that made it both impactful but also really difficult was that targets were, in theory, negotiated and they were, in theory, legally binding. So other countries had some degree of say in what your target was. In practice, it wasn't a vast amount of say. And only, of course, the developed countries, as they were enumerated in the early 90s, were making those binding commitments. Developing countries didn't have to do anything necessarily. Anything that they would do would be on a voluntary basis and they'd be assisted to do it. That was the logic then. Paris came about because it became clear both that developed countries would really struggle to make and deliver their commitments if there was no confidence that developing countries were also going to be in on the action. The United States couldn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol because of opposition to what they saw as an unbalanced agreement in the US Senate. But also it became clear that developed countries' binding commitments were not going to be followed by equally binding commitments from developing countries. Everybody was jealous of their sovereignty. And so the idea of Paris was, okay, nobody gets to tell anybody else what their commitment has to be. The commitments will be nationally determined, but we'll have this confidence-building framework where everybody agrees that they will commit something and that they will keep coming back to ensure to re-up their commitments in accordance with what they believe is possible as their highest achievable ambition at a point in time. And so far, that approach is like, it sounds very fluffy. There's no blue-helmeted global policeman waiting to rap you on the knuckles if you don't commit enough or you don't do enough. So far, it's working pretty well. The parties have been lifting their ambition and they are doing a hell of a lot more than they were before the Paris Agreement was struck. So, the game is not over, but progress is definitely being made.
Well, that's good news. I mean, that's great news. I think everyone will hear about 2 or 3 days of the climate conference or whatever it's called on the media when the state heads turn up, when the American president or the Australian Prime Minister or whoever goes turns up. But it actually goes for 2 weeks, doesn't it?
That's right. They have a week of technical negotiations and then ministers show up, not usually the heads of government. They may come for a high-level segment of global hobnobbing, but for the actual working negotiations, it is climate or energy or environment ministers who show up, and they lead the second week where once hopefully the technical issues have been resolved and the outstanding matters have narrowed down to those where big political calls are needed. In practice, often there are a lot of political issues that need to be resolved before anybody will give up their positions on some technical matters, but they try and narrow that down as much as possible. So there's a digestible set of things to be decided in the last week.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We better go to a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the COP29 coming up shortly. Before we do go to a break, You've been to several of these. Have you got a favourite child? Have you got one that was particularly good to you? And I guess I mean that not when you're being a tenant speaking or hosting on forums or when you're just nerding out on climate stuff, but just as a good event.
So, look, two of the best to me were the Paris COP in 2015, which was the first one that I made it to in person, and a really incredible event, just a huge number of interesting people. It was held in a disused airport on the outskirts of Paris, but there were a couple of chances in the weekend in the middle of things to go and have a look around Paris, which is not a bad idea if you get the chance. And it really set the course of the succeeding decade. And I remember the atmosphere the night that the agreement was actually struck was like beyond euphoric. People, grizzled climate negotiators dancing in a nightclub till 3 a.m. It was incredible. And then the other one I'd mention is Chile Madrid in 2019. It was meant to be hosted by Chile. They couldn't physically host it in the end because of huge protests against inequality and all kinds of social problems afflicting Chile. Spain stepped in with about 6 weeks' notice to host an event of 30 or 40,000 people, which if I had to do that, my head would explode. But you wouldn't have known. Logistically, it was smooth from start to finish. The negotiations were difficult, but I think Spain did themselves very proud, putting on that event very successfully.
Well, I say it's always a good idea to go to Spain. It's always a good time to go to Spain. I love the place. And you'll always have Paris. So there you go. We'll take a break. Be back in a minute.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying workers could result in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee has the right
employees will have the right to disconnect.
Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
And Tennant, you're off to Baku, Azerbaijan. Please tell me there's not going to be an Azerbaijan agreement they'll be talking about for the eternity, because that's just too hard to say. Is it one of those agreement type years or not?
So there is a big thing that is meant to be agreed this year. And they do try and, when possible, space out the big landing points so that there is a manageable workload for any given COP. This year, the big ticket item is what's called the new collective quantified goal, which is about climate finance and how much, by when, to whom, for what finance should flow from developed countries to developing countries, or maybe from a broader group of countries to developing countries. Back at the infamous 2009 Copenhagen COP, there was a commitment made initially by Barack Obama, but then supported by all the developed countries and reiterated over the years, that by 2020, these finance flows for climate purposes would reach $100 billion a year. Now, that number was hit. It was hit in 2022 rather than 2020. And you can go back and forth on whether that's a shocking dereliction of duty and a failure of countries to meet their commitments, or a remarkable scale up of big bucks making a difference. And both of those spins and more besides are put by parties in the negotiations. But the question is, what should follow that? That commitment runs through 2025. What comes next? and there's a wide range of ideas for what comes next, but it will all be about numbers bigger than 100 billion. Of course, that's including commercial finance, the flows that are investing in clean energy all across the world. Those are relevant to this. But so is government-to-government assistance and finance for climate adaptation, for helping places like Pakistan or Bangladesh be ready for the extremes of flooding and inundation that they have been experiencing in recent years, helping countries with aspects of decarbonisation that don't have a great business model yet. So there is a huge amount in those finance negotiations. And if they get to a good outcome on those this year, then I wouldn't be surprised if the Baku Bucks or the Baku Accord is part of the terminology.
Over the last few years, Tennant, the finance issue has been a big one, hasn't it? Everyone's been kind of saying, how do we make this fair? And fair is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, it totally is. And it's a big deal for a bunch of reasons. One of them is that a lot of developing countries just don't have great access to finance. They tend to experience investors reckon there's a substantial risk premium to investing in many developing countries. And sometimes that assessment is based on very obvious and hard to disagree with assessments of the amount of political risk, instability, tendency to mismanage public finances that some countries have had. Other times it seems like it's the result of a much broader, harder to justify attitude. In any case, whether you're talking about solar and wind or batteries or nuclear or most of the other technologies that are relevant to climate transition, they are very capital intensive. A lot of them have extremely low operating costs. It's the cost of building them and financing them in the first place that determines how affordable they are. And so this question of access to and cost of capital is a big deal for every country, but for these developing countries, India, much of Africa, their ability to do even the things that make financial sense, like substantially growing their renewable energy output, they will be much harder to do if there isn't not just large dollars of climate finance and energy finance out there, but a greater risk appetite or some way of moderating these risks to investors so that they are more willing to put their money where the biggest potential growth in emissions is to turn that around. And of course, most emissions growth now is coming from the developing world. The most developed countries are getting clean quite fast, and they've, as we never cease to hear at these conferences, the developed countries have a large historical responsibility for getting the world to the precipice it's on, but it is the pattern of growth, the emissions and technological makeup of growth in developing countries that will now determine whether we fall off that precipice or not.
Hence the need for the Baku Bucks.
That's right.
There was talk a while ago about a COP coming to Australia. Do you think we're going to see the Aussie version of this?
So that bid is still live at the time of recording. We don't know for sure what the outcome will be. Maybe we will find out in mid-November. Turkey is also bidding to host, and what we're both bidding for is COP31, set to be held in 2026. Now, Turkey are making a real go for it. Australia is also making a real go for it. AI Group has been supporting that bid, as have a lot of others. If we got it, wow, that will be a lot of work for Australia. Diplomatic work. It'll be a lot of logistical work. And of course, a huge amount of scrutiny would be on Australia as host. You don't need to be some kind of emerald green shining paragon of purity to host a COP. Azerbaijan is a petrostate. Dubai, or the United Arab Emirates hosting last year. Plenty of oil and gas revenue there. Poland has hosted it 3 times, and they're the most coal-intensive country in Europe, although their economy is changing quite rapidly now too. So it doesn't mean that there need to be unrealistic expectations on Australia, but we would need to be showing good faith on a lot of issues and visibly moving the local and the global dial on climate transition. And so there's opportunity in that if we get it, opportunity to forge more of those trade and investment partnerships that can help some of the really huge economic opportunities in Australia around clean minerals, clean energy, and clean energy intensive manufacturing to be realised. But when the eyes of the world are on you, you better watch out for banana peels.
Well, you're a commentator on the industry as much as a sort of an influencer within it. From a personal point of view, do you think it'd be good for Australia to have it here? You know, would it change the conversation within Australia, or would it make it harder?
Oh, look, I do think it would be a good thing to host. I think that one of the great things about being at a COP is the education you get on just how much is happening around the world, and the same sorts of challenges that other business organisations or civil society groups or farmers or others are experiencing in different countries. You get much more of a sense of the concreteness of this transition, but also like all the things that we still need to work on. And I'm very lucky to be able to go overseas to some of these COPs. So I do my best to cheapskate my way through it as much as possible, and thank goodness for the bargain bin at Airbnb. But a lot of people do not get to go to these things. If Australia hosts it, I think there'll be much more opportunity for all kinds of local stakeholders to get that insight into the scale and the challenges of transition around the world. And it doesn't mean that everybody's going to turn into some kind of climate champion or advocate. But I think grounding the local debate in more visibility. We sometimes talk as if Australia is acting alone or facing challenges in acting that nobody else is. And actually, there's a lot of commonality around the world, and a lot that we can not just learn from others, but actually that they can learn from some of the solutions we're finding. We're one of the cheapest places in the world to put solar on your roof. It costs 2 to 3 times as much in California, for instance, to put solar on your roof. There are things that we are pioneering that others can learn from. And of course, we've got a lot of resources that can help to underpin transition around the world.
Yeah. Considering the opportunities that exist in Australia for a post-carbon world, our national conversation is quite immature or quite shallow often. So it'd be nice to see a more robust conversation. One thing I would say is that I know from an absolute fact that when you are at COP, you work incredibly hard. I can't believe how much information and activity you punch out. So it's not a holiday for you. I know that.
If anyone is a glutton for punishment, have a look at my LinkedIn during COP, and I'll be putting up notes of all the fascinating side events. And unless you're super keen, you probably don't want to read the notes of the negotiations because they can be pretty arcane. But there are incredible side events put on by major universities, by businesses and business associations, going through the latest developments in the steel industry or in the intersection of trade and climate and what's happening with tariffs or carbon border adjustments. There's a lot there, and I will be faithfully typing it out and sticking it on LinkedIn for anyone to have a look.
And I hope that we will see in at least some of form of your socials the famous Tennant culinary critiques of the land in which you're travelling. We really do need to go. Look, considering we're both supposed to be professionals at this, I've successfully managed to bury the lead. What's all this mean for business? What's the point of COP in terms of business?
So the COP is the place where global momentum on climate is grown or that it ebbs away, depending on whatever happens that year. The content of what is negotiated comes back into local policies that affect business directly. The pushes on things like the reporting of climate-related matters by business that have been a piece of the action alongside the last several COPs are being felt now by businesses gearing up for climate-related financial disclosure. So there is a flow from these events back to what we need to deal with at home. And the finance matters this year are going to shape the extent of both opportunity and expectation on private business around its global investment footprint and how support is flowing to help make more transition more practical around the world. So parts of it will remain arcane, but there really is a concrete upshot for the rest of us.
It's something we need to pay attention to, and thank you for putting the flavour around it so that when we do hear about it or read about it, we now have a deeper understanding. Thank you so much. Hey, I don't think I've told you. I was speaking at a function a little while ago on digitalisation and decarbonisation, and we're talking about new energy sources, and a delightful lady put her hand up and said, in terms of global shipping and new energy sources, have they ever thought about wind power? Smart Alec. Yeah, well, probably no, more solar. Anyway, thank you very much. Good luck in Baku. I hope you have a successful trip, and I look forward to hearing all about it. When actually is it? It's November 5, is it?
So the COP will be held from November the 11th through to the 22nd.
Okay.
Although these things usually run a little bit over. I will be ready if it does. I hope I don't have to sleep on a couch in the conference centre through the wee hours of the morning, but you never know.
My good mate Chris Rangel has always said you never waste a deadline. You know, if you've got a deadline, use it. And that's always the case. We've had that conversation in previous conversations on COP. Thank you, Tennant. Really appreciate it. It's been another fascinating conversation. And that's it for another episode of Supply Circles. Thanks again to everyone for listening, and thanks for your feedback. If you have any feedback on today's conversation with Tennant or ideas for the show, or if you just want to hit me up and give me some feedback, head over to james.scotland@aigroup.com.au or to my LinkedIn page. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back in a fortnight with more business improvement insights into the keys to building sustainable supply chains. Thanks for joining me. This is Supply Circles. I'm James Scotland. Bye for now.